Something extraordinary happens inside your body the moment visceral fat begins to release, and almost nobody talks about it. Not your doctor, not your trainer, not the weight loss industry that profits from keeping you confused. Because here's the truth that most people never discover. Losing visceral fat is not just about getting smaller. It is not just about fitting into old clothes or seeing a lower number on a scale. When visceral fat begins to let go, your entire biology changes. Your hormones reset, your brain rewires, your organs begin functioning at levels they have not reached in years. And processes that were silently killing you, processes you could not see, could not feel, and were never warned about, begin to reverse. Before we go any further, subscribe right now and hit the bell because this channel delivers science-based body transformation content that explains what is actually happening inside you, not just what to do on the outside. Today, I'm revealing exactly what happens inside your body, organ by organ, hormone by hormone, cell by cell, when visceral fat begins to release. By the end of this video, you will understand why visceral fat is fundamentally different from any other fat in your body, why losing it triggers a cascade of biological events that most people never experience because they never lose the right kind of fat, why the first 2 weeks of visceral fat loss produce changes you can feel before you can see them, and the one biological shift that happens when visceral fat releases that researchers are calling the closest thing to a full body reset that human physiology is capable of producing. Stay until the end, because the last revelation changes how you think about your body forever. Here is what you need to feel before we begin. Picture this. You wake up one morning and something feels different. You cannot quite name it. Your mind seems clearer than it has been in months. The inflammation that made your joints feel stiff first thing in the morning is slightly less aggressive. Your energy before your first coffee is, surprisingly, present. You have not lost significant weight yet. The scale has barely moved. Your clothes fit the same. But something inside you has shifted. That is not imagination. That is not placebo. That is your biology responding to the first measurable release of visceral fat from around your organs. And what is triggering that feeling, down to the molecular level, is what this entire video is about. Here is what most people fundamentally misunderstand about visceral fat. They think of it as stored energy, passive, waiting, simply taking up space around the midsection. It is none of those things. Visceral fat, the fat that wraps around your liver, your kidneys, your intestines, your heart, and your pancreas, is one of the most metabolically active tissues in the human body. It is not passive storage. It is an active endocrine organ. It produces hormones, it generates inflammatory signals, it communicates directly with your brain, your immune system, and every major organ in your body. And almost all of that communication is harmful. Visceral fat continuously secretes cytokines, inflammatory messenger molecules that circulate throughout the bloodstream and trigger chronic low-grade inflammation in virtually every tissue they reach. It produces resistin, a hormone that directly blocks insulin receptor function, worsening insulin resistance with every gram of visceral fat that accumulates. It releases free fatty acids directly into the portal vein, the blood vessel that feeds your liver, causing the liver to become progressively more overloaded and dysfunctional. It suppresses adiponectin, one of the most important anti-inflammatory insulin-sensitizing hormones your body produces. Low adiponectin is directly associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic syndrome. This is not background noise. This is an active, continuous biological attack on your health, happening silently, invisibly, without symptoms until the damage has compounded for years. And this is why what happens when visceral fat begins to release is so profound. You are not just losing fat, you are silencing an organ that has been poisoning you. Here is the first thing that happens when visceral fat begins to let go. Your liver begins to breathe again. Most people never connect their visceral fats to their liver function, but this connection is one of the most critical in all of metabolic medicine. Here is the problem that builds silently for years. Visceral fat sits in direct anatomical proximity to your liver and releases free fatty acids constantly into the portal circulation, the blood system that flows directly from your abdominal organs into your liver. Your liver receives this continuous flood of excess fat and has no choice but to process it. Over time, as visceral fat accumulates, this flood exceeds the liver's processing capacity. The excess fat begins to deposit inside liver cells themselves. This is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFL, and research from the American Liver Foundation estimates that up to 75% of people who are overweight have some degree of it, most completely unaware. A fatty liver cannot perform its over 500 functions at full capacity. It cannot regulate blood sugar efficiently, it cannot process hormones properly, it cannot clear inflammatory compounds from the bloodstream, it cannot produce proteins needed for immune function, it cannot metabolize medications correctly. But here's what happens the moment visceral fat begins to release. The flow of free fatty acids into the portal circulation begins to decrease. Your liver, which has remarkable regenerative capacity, begins clearing its own fat deposits within days to weeks of sustained visceral fat reduction. A landmark study published in the journal Cell Metabolism found that participants who lost as little as 5% of their body weight, primarily visceral fat through dietary intervention, showed measurable liver fat reduction of up to 42% within 8 weeks. 42% liver fat reduction in 8 weeks from losing visceral fat. As the liver clears, its functional capacity begins recovering rapidly. Blood sugar regulation improves because the liver's glucose output becomes normalized. Inflammatory compound clearance improves because the liver's detoxification capacity recovers. Hormone metabolism improves because the liver can now process estrogen, cortisol, and insulin more efficiently. The energy you feel when visceral fat first begins to release, that clarity, that subtle vitality, much of it is coming from here, from a liver that is finally getting relief from a flood it has been trying to manage for years. And the next thing that happens, this one surprises almost everyone because it involves an organ that most people never think of in the context of fat loss at all. The second thing that happens when visceral fat begins to let go, your pancreas recovers its ability to produce insulin properly. This is the connection that could save millions of people from type 2 diabetes, and almost nobody explains it clearly. Here is the mechanism. Your pancreas sits directly adjacent to visceral fat deposits in the abdominal cavity. As visceral fat accumulates, it physically encases the pancreas in inflammatory tissue. The cytokines and free fatty acids released from surrounding visceral fat infiltrate pancreatic tissue directly, damaging the beta cells responsible for insulin production and impairing the glucagon-producing alpha cells that regulate blood sugar between meals. Research from the University of Newcastle, led by Professor Roy Taylor, whose work has fundamentally changed how type 2 diabetes is understood, found that visceral fat specifically infiltrating the pancreas is the primary driver of beta cell dysfunction in type 2 diabetes. And here is the finding that genuinely shocked the medical community. When visceral fat was reduced through a sustained caloric deficit, not through surgery, not through medication, through dietary intervention alone, pancreatic fat deposits decreased measurably, and as they decreased, beta cell function began to recover. Insulin production normalized. In participants who had carried type 2 diabetes for up to 10 years, the disease went into remission, not managed, not controlled, remission. Professor Taylor's research showed that this pancreatic recovery happens specifically when visceral fat releases, not just subcutaneous fat under the skin. This is why two people can lose the same number of pounds and have completely different outcomes. One person loses primarily subcutaneous fat from diet changes that do not effectively target visceral fat. Their pancreas remains encased, their insulin production remains impaired. The other person loses visceral fat, their pancreas begins to recover, their insulin sensitivity improves dramatically, their fasting glucose drops, their A1C moves toward normal. Same weight lost, completely different biology. When you feel your blood sugar stabilizing, when the afternoon energy crashes start to disappear, when the cravings between meals begin to ease, that's your pancreas recovering its voice, recovering its ability to communicate with your body through insulin the way it was designed to. And what happens next in your cardiovascular system is where the numbers become genuinely staggering. Right here, if this is explaining something about your body that nobody has ever connected for you before, hit the like button right now. And I want to ask you a personal question. Where do you carry your weight? And have you ever been told by a doctor specifically about visceral fat versus subcutaneous fat? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Because understanding where your fat sits changes everything about how you should approach losing it. The third thing that happens when visceral fat begins to let go, your cardiovascular system undergoes a measurable structural recovery. Most people think of heart disease risk in terms of cholesterol numbers, but the relationship between visceral fat and cardiovascular disease goes far deeper than a lipid panel. Here is what visceral fat does to your cardiovascular system that your cholesterol test does not show. These numbers represent a fundamental shift in cardiovascular risk profile, not from medication, from the biological changes that visceral fat release triggers automatically. The arteries that were inflamed begin to calm. The endothelium that was being chronically damaged begins to repair. The blood that was in a hypercoagulable state begins to normalize. Your heart, which has been working against elevated resistance, elevated inflammation, and elevated clotting risk, begins operating in a more hospitable environment. People described feeling this as a subtle but persistent sense of physical ease, a reduction in the background tension that they had become so accustomed to they stopped noticing it. That ease is real, and it is your cardiovascular system exhaling. The fourth thing that happens when visceral fat begins to let go, your brain rewires. This is the one that most surprises people because we think of fat loss as a body process, not a brain process. But here's what most people do not realize. Visceral fat does not just affect your body below the neck. Its inflammatory output crosses the blood-brain barrier. The cytokines produced by visceral fat, particularly IL-6, TNF-alpha, and IL-1 beta, are small enough to penetrate the brain's protective barrier and trigger neuroinflammation directly. Research from the University of California found that higher visceral fat volume was directly correlated with smaller hippocampal volume, meaning visceral fat was literally shrinking the brain's memory center. But here's what happens when visceral fat releases. The inflammatory cytokine output begins to drop within weeks of measurable visceral fat reduction. Neuroinflammation decreases. Hippocampal neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells, begins to recover. Dopamine receptor sensitivity improves as the inflammatory suppression of the reward system begins to lift. The brain you had before visceral fat accumulated is not gone. It is suppressed, and it begins to re-emerge as the inflammation that was suppressing it begins to lift. So let us quickly take stock of what we've covered. When visceral fat begins to release, your liver clears its fat deposits and recovers its 500 functions. Your pancreas begins recovering beta cell function and insulin production capacity. Your cardiovascular system undergoes measurable structural improvement in triglycerides, blood pressure, clotting risk, and arterial inflammation. And your brain begins to neurochemically rewire as the inflammatory assault on your hippocampus and dopamine system begins to lift. 4 profound biological transformations, all triggered by the release of one specific type of fat. But the fifth transformation, the one I've been building toward this entire video, is the one that researchers are calling the most significant, because it doesn't just improve one organ or one system, it resets the master control system of your entire biology. And it is coming up right now. The fifth and most profound thing that happens when visceral fat begins to let go, your hormonal architecture completely rebuilds. This is the grand finale, and when you understand it fully, you will understand why people who successfully release visceral fat describe the experience not as losing weight, but as becoming a different person. Here is the complete hormonal picture. Visceral fat is the primary driver of the most damaging hormonal environment the human body can operate in. It elevates cortisol, not just through the stress response, but through a direct enzymatic mechanism. Visceral fat contains an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD1 that converts inactive cortisone into active cortisol locally within the fat tissue itself. This means visceral fat generates its own cortisol independent of your stress levels, and that locally produced cortisol feeds back into promoting more visceral fat accumulation, another vicious cycle within the larger one. It elevates estrogen in both men and women through the aromatase enzyme present in visceral fat tissue, converting androgens into estrogen. In men, this drives the hormonal feminization associated with abdominal obesity, reduced testosterone, increased breast tissue development, reduced muscle mass, reduced libido, increased emotional reactivity. In women, this contributes to estrogen dominance, worsening PMS, irregular cycles, increased cancer risk, and accelerated perimenopause symptoms. Now here's what happens when visceral fat releases, and this is the cascade that researchers are describing as a full hormonal reset. The 11-beta-HSD1 enzyme output decreases as visceral fat volume decreases. Local cortisol drops. As local cortisol drops, the cortisol-driven signal to accumulate more visceral fat weakens. The cycle begins to break. Aromatase activity decreases as visceral fat tissue shrinks. Estrogen levels begin to normalize. In men, testosterone begins recovering as the estrogen feedback suppression of the hypothalamic-pituitary axis is relieved. Research from the journal Obesity found that men who lost meaningful visceral fat through lifestyle intervention showed testosterone increases of 15 to 30% without any hormonal medication. This is why people who release significant visceral fat describe the transformation in terms that go beyond physical appearance. They describe thinking differently, feeling differently, wanting different things, making different choices, not through willpower, but because the hormonal architecture of their body has literally rebuilt itself. The body you are living in right now, if it is carrying significant visceral fat, is operating under a hormonal suppression that affects your thoughts, your emotions, your decisions, your energy, your relationships, and your sense of self. The body that emerges as visceral fat releases is not a thinner version of the same person. It's a hormonally, neurologically, and metabolically different person operating in the same life. Here's your action framework starting today. Understand that visceral fat responds to different inputs than subcutaneous fat. The most powerful interventions for visceral fat specifically are time-restricted eating that creates a sustained overnight fasting window, resistance training that activates the large muscle groups creating the insulin sensitivity window visceral fat responds to, stress management that reduces the cortisol-driven visceral fat accumulation signal, and sleep optimization that protects growth hormone secretion and prevents the cortisol dysregulation that drives visceral fat. These are not generic weight loss tips. Each one is targeting a specific mechanism in the visceral fat accumulation and release cycle. You don't need to do all of them at once. Pick one. Do it for 2 weeks. Track how you feel, not just how you look, because the feeling changes come before the visible changes. And if you understand what those feelings mean biologically, as you now do, you'll have the knowledge to keep going when the scale hasn't yet caught up with the transformation happening inside you. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these 5 biological changes surprised you most? The liver recovery, the pancreas rehabilitation, the cardiovascular reset, the brain rewiring, or the hormonal rebuild? Comment below right now. Tell me which one you felt most personally connected to, because it might reveal where your body is most urgently waiting for change. Hit like if this gave you a framework for understanding your body that changes how you think about fat loss entirely. Subscribe and hit the bell, because next week I'm releasing the complete visceral fat reduction protocol, the exact lifestyle interventions ranked by their specific impact on visceral fat reduction as opposed to subcutaneous fat, with the timing, sequencing, and combination strategies that accelerate the biological cascade we discussed today. And before you go, don't skip the video on your screen right now. It reveals the 5 daily habits that research shows are specifically driving visceral fat accumulation in people who eat well and exercise regularly, habits so normalized in modern life that most people never suspect them. If you're doing everything right and still carrying visceral fat around your midsection, this video explains exactly why. Watch that next. Your visceral fat is not permanent. It's not inevitable. It's not a life sentence. It's biology, and biology responds to the right signals. Start sending them today.